Thanks very much for the introduction, Michael, and thanks also for Social Justice Ireland for the invitation to present, and not only that, for the flexibility in the schedule. This is not an international experiment that I'm telling you about. They very graciously moved me because of a teaching commitment I have later on today. So I am very grateful. I've made two faux pas already. The first is I used the exact same PowerPoint template as yours, so it was a consistency across the two presentations. And the second is I have it in widescreen rather than the standard screen. I was in this room 2 weeks ago and I did the opposite. I had the 4:3 and it was widescreen, so I said I must do widescreen if it's in Coke Park. Obviously, whatever I do, it's going to be the opposite. I just can't win, so I just live with that. Hopefully, it's legible anyway, and I'll read through. Most people in this room who live in Ireland will be familiar with the context. This just shows the increase in average rents between 2011 and 2016, the third quarter of each year. This is, remember as well that the people who live in rented accommodation disproportionately come from lower income and lower wealth households. So the increase that we've seen in rents in some parts of Dublin, I have 66% there by postcode. There's some areas within postcodes that have seen 70-75% increases in rents. That's not the national average. The national average increase in rent is a good bit lower. You can see there places like Offaly and Waterford. This is just a sort of a selection of places. The increase in rents, they're around 25%. The 25% increase in rents when the cost of living is, on average, roughly stable, tells you there's something going wrong in your accommodation sector, or housing as a system is probably another way of thinking about it. And it's, as you can see, it's particularly acute in the Greater Dublin area. So Dublin, Meath, Kildare, they're the areas that have seen the biggest increase in rents. You can see Cork and Galway cities as well have seen a big increase in rents. And that's a problem, because if we're coming at it from the point of view of universal basic income, if you don't address housing as something of a special good or a special sector, then you would look at the general cost of living and say, well, it hasn't increased in the last 5 years. But actually, one of the two, along with food, one of the two most important goods in your basket for every citizen has seen a dramatic increase. And this is particularly true if your circumstances change. So if you stay in a tenancy, your rent may stay the same or only go up by a couple of €100, whereas if you have to move, you're reset at the market rate. So you're in there with everyone else looking for somewhere to live. And of course, if you suffer a negative income shock, if you lose a job, you might find yourself back out on the rental market and you face these significantly higher rents. I looked at these figures specifically for the conference. The last figures come from the DAF.ie reports. This is just looking at the average rent for a room. So what I showed you before was for dwellings, for a mix of everything from 1 to 5 bed dwellings, apartments, houses, and so on. This is just looking at the kind of accommodation that those on lowest incomes would the rents they would be faced with. And you can see it goes all the way back to 2002. Your single room is the red line and double room is the yellow line. And you can see that there was as we were building lots of property before we opened up our labour market, rental room costs fell 2002, 3, 4. Then we opened up our labour markets. There was huge inward migration. And even though we were building lots, we weren't building enough in Dublin to meet the new demand, and rents rose significantly. And then, of course, the economic crash happened and there was a dramatic fall in rents. If you put this in annual terms, as I have on the bottom left there, at the peak of the Celtic Tiger, if you were renting a single room in Dublin, your annual bill was about €5,000. That fell to €4,000, so that's obviously good news for people on low incomes, but since has gone from €4,000 up to €6,000. So people who are living in single rooms are spending significantly more now than they did at the peak of the Celtic Tiger about 10 years ago. So that's some just figures for context in terms of why I felt that housing was an area that deserves its own analysis, distinct from the general concept of either a basic income or a basic guarantee of income, which would be more like a negative income tax. The other aspect of this, of course, is the idea of a constitutional right to housing. So I feel there's a jarring contrast between an economy where you've got unemployment and you've got stagnant incomes, and then at the same time you've got a growing population and a rising cost of income. And how do you square that circle and give people a meaningful right to housing? And lots of people have talked about it. This is just one example from the Irish Times last year. So what I'd like to do is connect up the idea of a right to housing with the idea of a universal basic income through the concept of a universal housing subsidy, or an income contingent subsidy, which I know is a deviation a little bit from the idea that we've talked about so far, but I'll explain why I go down that route. And in short, I do this because even if we did manage to pass a referendum tomorrow that said we have a right to housing, it's still going to take a court case and somebody to be left out of that right, and then appeals, and then there'll be a solution for that person, and then it'll be how do we convert that solution for that person who took that court case all the way to whatever high court. How do we convert that into a general principle that gives people a right to housing? And I have absolutely no problem with putting a right to housing in. What this is, the contribution, is how you might do that. If you put it in, you're going to need a means as well as an end. And what I think this can contribute to is an understanding of the kind of means that that would work for giving people a right to housing. One last indication of the nature of the problem, that this is just focusing on the Greater Dublin area again, where the problem is most acute. The blue line across the top is the number of new households that were formed in the Greater Dublin area every month between 2011 and 2016. About 650 new households a month. So rapidly growing population. In fact, it's probably an underestimate, because people would have formed households if there were more housing available and stayed at home with their parents longer. So it's an underestimate. It's a lower bound, that's 650 a month. And then the bars underneath are the completions by local authority in each of those months. So not a single month in those 5.5 years did we get to 650. So particularly if you take the first half, there's a huge backlog of pent-up demand. They're not being met by new accommodation. And I don't have time today, but we can talk about vacant homes. There's a one-off win there in terms of better using our vacant homes. But the real problem here is that we've converted as success a growing population, something that most European countries would love to have, a problem most European countries would love to have. We've turned that into a problem, because if you have a 10%, putting it in its most basic terms, I'm an economist to keep things simple, if you've got a 10% increase in demand in number of people, you need a 10% increase in supply, number of dwellings. Slightly more complicated than that, but really not that much more complicated than that. And we haven't seen that increase in supply. And even the increases in construction activity that have happened over the last year or so, it's still well below the levels of construction we need, even just to address the new supply, let alone to deal with this backlog. So we've a deep-seated, we have a chronic problem here. Oops, sorry. So thinking about housing as a system, and this will take a couple of minutes just to walk through, what are the policy levers that would guarantee you've got a housing system that works? And then where would a universal housing income or subsidy sit in that system? So the first is, well, you don't want a bubble to happen again. Ireland of all countries knows that you don't want house prices to go far above affordability, because it's temporary. Even if people are getting really generous loans, that's going to end someday when the banks lose confidence. So the mortgage rules that the central bank have introduced, I would tweak them a little bit, but I'd much rather take them the way they are than not have them at all. And 2-3 years ago, this was my chief concern, that we were going down the exact same road we went down in the 1990s, early 2000s, that a scarcity of housing turned itself into a credit bubble because everyone got used to the idea of prices rising rapidly. That, I believe, is no longer a risk, but we still have real problems. Just because it's not a bubble, a credit-fueled bubble, we still have issues there. And I think the two urgent ones here now are the cost of construction and how we do social housing, how we provide housing for those who can't afford housing, even if we were to lower the costs of construction. And what I'll work through in the next couple of slides is the people who can afford housing, why construction costs matter, if we're thinking about that group, and then what we do for the group that, even if we reform that, wouldn't be able to afford housing. Say land use is a bigger issue. That's something that's been going wrong for 30 to 50 years. It would be great to sort that out, but let's get the urgent stuff sorted first, and then we can worry about land use. So let's go through, this is what I'm calling a status quo, the current situation. We have a 2 adults, 2 children family, and we're going to be quite modest in our aim for this family. We're going to put them in a 2-bedroom apartment. So let's build them a 2-bedroom apartment. How much does that cost? Well, in terms of hard cost per square metre, it's close to €2,000 a square metre. I figures for Amsterdam, actually, and it's between 1,200 and 1,300 euro a square metre hard costs. So something's gone wrong there. Why that matters, you'll see as we work through the numbers. You can go from your hard costs per square metre, you can multiply that out to get your upfront cost. So on top of your hard costs, you've got your soft costs, which include VAT, your professionals' fees, a margin for the developer that is there. We can assume it away in certain circumstances, but it is going to be there. That's 12.5% in this assumption. And you can work out the upfront cost, excluding land, of an apartment. And about €260,000. I was at a meeting this morning where I was told it's significantly higher than that, so I'll be revising my figures. That doesn't help. And then if you think like somebody who owns property and is looking for a return, a 5% net yield means that you're talking about a break-even rent that if you've 260,000, you take off a couple of zeros and divide by 2, and you get your break-even monthly rent. So 260,000 converts into 1,300 a month as your break-even rent, with no land costs in there, but with a return for the developer, with VAT, with all your hard costs, with your professional fees and so on. Now, if you have this family earning €45,000 a year, they have an after-tax annual income of about 3,000 a month. If you've 3,000 a month, you shouldn't be spending more than 1,000 a month on your accommodation. So a rough rule of thumb, a third of your disposable income on accommodation. So this family, can afford to spend about 1,000 a month on accommodation. And if we were to go and build them an apartment with free land, so we've just confiscated the land from someone, the break-even rent would be 1,300. So it's clear to me that if you just cut to the bold line at the bottom, that your solution here is, if you can't afford, and forget about land costs, if you can't afford the hard costs, the non-land costs of your accommodation, and society wants people to have an effective right to housing, society needs to write the check for the gap. So in this case, €1,300 for a 2-bedroom apartment per month. This household shouldn't be spending more than €1,000. Society needs to write them a check for €300 a month. Now, this is an example I've chosen because it also shows the problem with the current system. Construction costs are so high that we need to subsidise a family that's on an above average income to afford a newly built apartment. I estimated that the minimum spec 2-bed apartment in Dublin is only affordable by the top 10% of the income distribution. So we need to do something drastic. What I'm proposing today is as a housing subsidy for those who need it, rather than as a universal basic income. Clearly the two are related. If you can afford one, you can move towards the other. But let's start with the cheaper of the two options. It's a right to income for housing rather than a right to, than a gift of housing income. So suppose we were able to change hard costs that they were cheaper. Instead of €1,900 or €1,800, it was €1,500. And I'm doing something controversial. I'm changing the size as well. I'm doing this to get the break-even rent down to a point where this household has some choice. That it's not that they need a subsidy for the bare minimum, is that they actually can afford the bare minimum and beyond. That if we lower the construction costs, we change the size, this household goes from being able to afford 62 square metres to being able to afford 75 square metres. That's just from lowering the costs. And by lowering the minimum requirement from 80 to 60, not popular, you end up not having to subsidise. This household now can spend €800 a month for the break-even minimum standard apartment, or else they can choose to go for something bigger. As I say, cutting minimum standards is not the solution, but excessive minimum standards may be part of the problem. if they add to costs. So if you add in lift requirements or basement car parking space requirements that are out of line with every other European city, and those things are very costly to provide, it will show up in your break-even costs. So we need to analyse construction costs in order to bring in a right to housing through a housing subsidy. A more familiar example to people who work for social justice would be if we look at somebody who's a single person and we're looking to house them in a one-bed apartment. The break-even cost is about €180,000. So that's a 900 a month break-even rent. If this person earns 15,000 a year, if that's their income, they've only got about 400 a month they can spend on accommodation. So to get them into a one-bedroom apartment, you'd need to be subsidising them about €500 a month. Again, if you can lower costs, and again, if you change size, not popular, you get down to a much more manageable subsidy of €50 a month. And my point here is that minimum standards and housing, social housing, are two sides of the same coin. Because if you price people out by putting in minimum standards, you have to write the check. So we need to figure out put it another way, if we want to subsidise a third, the bottom third of the income distribution, put them in social housing, you have to then find out what the 33rd percentile can afford. And your minimum spec has to be at that income level. Otherwise, you're creating a gap between who you support and what the market will support. So that's why I see those two as intricately linked. If we can get through whatever means, it doesn't have to be reducing sizes. It can be greater efficiencies in construction. It can be greater competition in construction. It can be questioning whether a 12.5% margin is the right margin for a developer. It can be thinking about the VAT rate. Whatever it is, we need to be able to have an open discussion around everything that goes into the cost of building that's not land. We can fix land. Trust me, I want to do that too. But let's start with the stuff that is wrong in Ireland and doesn't look wrong in other countries. And that's the high construction costs. And by doing that, you then create an obvious link for any household that can't afford the minimum spec, whatever the socially agreed minimum spec is. There's an implicit, and we should make it explicit, commitment to say, well, if this is what we believe the human right is, it's 80 square metres, it's a lift for every apartment, it's a basement car parking space for every apartment. If that's what we believe, then we need to write a pretty big check, because it's only the top 10 or 20% that can afford that. Is it viable to have 10 or 20% not supported and 80 to 90% in receipt of subsidies? I would suggest that financially we need to be thinking more like somewhere between 20 and 50% get support, maybe 30, maybe 40%. And then it's figuring out what they can afford, and that's where your minimum spec come from. Because the problem at the moment is we design these minimum spec with absolutely no awareness if they have any cost implications. And if they have cost implications, it's assumed that the developer is going to put up with that and reduce the profit margin. Developers work off a percentage basis. If you add something to the bottom, the hard costs, you're actually adding to their profits, because the baseline that they're taking 12.5% of has just got bigger. So it's not the easy solution, sort of either banning rents or making land free. And we may want to do those things. They're not going to help solve the problem. The problem here is an anemic construction sector that just has got, the costs have just gone way out. How much of that is policy failure, how much of that is market failure is open for debate. But for me, this is the key. If you're going to get a universal housing subsidy for those who need it, and this would replace Part 5, it would replace local authority housing, it would replace the rent supplement scheme. Rent supplement is a terrible idea. It's a fixed amount. You either get it or you don't. If you're €1 below the threshold, you get the full amount. If you earn absolutely nothing, you get the same amount. What this would do is, as your income goes up, your subsidy goes down. As you get to the threshold between needing a subsidy or not, you're basically getting very small help. This is why it's different to a universal basic income, at least to start. I think universal basic income is the right way to go. I just don't think, however unfeasible what I'm suggesting, financially unfeasible, how financially costly it is, I think that's another level for the moment, given how costly it is to build in Ireland. So how much would something like that cost? Well, if we think about the lower half of the income distribution as earning on average about 15,000 a year, that means they have about 400 a month That means the most they can afford to spend as an upfront amount, this is our upfront cost of construction, is €80,000. So if the minimum cost of a one bed is twice that, then you'd be talking about an exposure of about, I have that as 5% of GDP, it's 2.5% of GDP, about €5 billion would be the cost of a universal housing subsidy as opposed to a universal basic housing income. And there may be good reasons that whatever about non-housing, with housing you'd keep it as a subsidy, because if you own your own house and don't have a mortgage, there may not be much sense in giving taxpayer money to somebody who's got an asset. But certainly for those who need it, this is the sort of rough parameter. The more you can drive down the cost of construction, the cheaper this becomes. And that's not with sacrificing standards, if we can do that. This is with finding why is it so expensive in Ireland compared to the Netherlands or compared to Canada or compared to wherever we might be able to compare ourselves to. And that's why it's quite welcome that earlier this week the Minister for Housing announced that they were going to do this audit of construction costs. And people like me have been shouting about that for a couple of years now because it's so important. And this is not a sop to developers. This is, you talk to Clúid or you talk to Tuo or you talk to Respond, these organisations depend on the nature of the subsidy and the level of construction costs. They've had organisations looking to lend the money over the last 5 years. Ireland's got high unemployment. Surely you guys must be out the doors creating new social housing. And they say, well, actually the finances don't stack up. The finances would stack up. Could you imagine if we had a universal housing subsidy and you got a developer like one of these REITs that we've set up, and one of the housing bodies goes to the REIT and says, you build an apartment block on that site, I'll take 40% of your units straight away. How can I guarantee that? Well, because either they have the income, or if they don't have the income, society's going to top them up. And that's what I'd love our social housing system to move towards, because it allows housing bodies to develop expertise and scale and provide housing for those, particularly in the lower third of the income distribution, who are at the moment being completely shut out by city councils and county councils. They're not providing the supports, and they're designing regulations that aren't tailored towards lower income households. So that's where I'll leave it. Looking forward to comments and questions. I'm sure there's plenty of those. And thanks again for the invitation and for your attention.
Thanks very much, Ronan. As you said, I think there's plenty of food for thought there. We'll take a couple of quick questions if we can. We've this gentleman here, just if we get the microphone to, and as I said previously, please, if you wouldn't mind, if you could identify yourself with someone below as well.
Emmanuel Sweeney. I just wanted to mention to you, because you did focus on costs and so on, but I understand there's 85 billion in deposit accounts in Ireland, so that gives me some level of confidence in money being there for housing. Also, would you have an opinion on why the state is so dysfunctional in dealing with the housing problem? Would it be possible to give every TD a box of Lego for Christmas and to get them in on the idea of how housing is achieved? Just a final point, would you think that the historical legacy of the class system in the United Kingdom that was brought to Ireland is affecting people thinking in a new state way? In other words, the vibrancy of a new state hasn't arrived yet. We're still waiting on the vibrancy of our independence to actually address issues that's facing the people in the country, and perhaps that might be a reason for the level of dysfunctionality.
Okay, and we've just one below here, yeah, just.
Hi, Rory Hearn from Task. I think that there's a number of problems with the argument as presented, unfortunately, in the area of housing, and the underlying assumptions in Ronan's paper is essentially a neoclassical approach to the housing market, which is based on the theory of supply and demand. But of course, the housing market is a completely dysfunctional market with huge monopolies in terms of ownership of land, and the idea that just giving a subsidy to households would somehow incentivize supply, whether construction costs are reduced or not, it would lead us to the same problem we're in now, which is when you don't have supply, you have increasing prices. And also its costs are assuming a private finance, private construction costs. The state, local authorities can actually provide housing between 100,000 per unit, 150,000 per unit. And the reason we have a crisis is because the state stopped building local authority social housing. And I think that there's a danger in this approach, which is if you keep giving subsidies without any controls like rent control, then the prices will just increasing and the state will have to keep increasing its subsidy. And I think so in this case that the answer is actually more state provision of affordable and social housing directly, rather than relying on the private sector, which has given us the crisis we have.
Okay, Ronan, if you address.
Yeah, on the first one, I do think a huge part of the solution to this is not far off from your Lego idea. What I would love to do is to send members of a local authority on their team away day into a room for 3 hours, show them a site and say, build something on that and make it work, make the numbers work. And we'll give you a quantity surveyor and an architect and whoever else, a developer, whatever expertise you need. We'll go into that site and show me how it's viable, or show me how you'd make it viable, because they don't understand that. And Rory's right in relation to when the state stopped building housing, it lost the expertise around understanding the cost implications of building housing. In relation to the money on deposit, yeah, I know, for example, with the credit unions, they can't find a good use for their money. And the members don't want to borrow, they want to save. And what we're left with is the odd situation. And this is why I would call for something like this, is that it seems to me obvious. You've got idle wealth in Ireland and you've got a housing need. You just connect the dot. It's not, I mean, this is, other countries have wrestled with this. How do you do that? Well, you target it based on need. And the state acts as collateral for the purchasing power of individual households. And if the purchasing power of the individual households isn't sufficient, then the state makes sure it is. And that would, for me, and this I suppose gets me on to Rory's points, make sure that you've integrated housing. It's not the case that every government scheme turned into a ghetto. That's not true. But it is the case that many state-built schemes became ghettos because they weren't integrated. And we know that inequality in later life stems from inequality in the first 5 years. And for me, an obvious part of the solution is making sure that you have private-owned, private-rented, and social housing people living beside each other. As the Minister for Housing says, you don't know who's who. You shouldn't know who's who. It shouldn't be important who's who. And that's my worry about the state directly building. And Rory's figures, unfortunately, are completely wrong. The €100,000 cheaper for local authorities to build is only if the local authorities don't face the expenses that a private developer or a housing body does. I could say the exact same. If you cut out the local authority contributions, VAT and other things, then it's just as cheap for a housing body or for a private developer to build. The point is that, and that's why I was trying to get away from who is building and onto the cost of building. The state cannot build cheaper than the private sector, than a housing body, because it faces the same costs. If you go out into the market now and tender for a building project of 500 homes, you will get a certain amount of cost back. And Rory's solution might be to employ directly. That's fine. You're still competing in the same labour market. You still have to pay the same wage rates. You won't be able to, you will be able to get some scale. But I would argue that through procurement, you can get the same scale anyway with the subsidy scheme. That by acting as the collateral, the backstop for the housing demand of every single household in Ireland, ensuring that they have the means to afford a home. By doing that, you get the housing bodies at scale. So this is true in other countries. You look across Europe, you've got housing bodies, either profit-making or non-profit-making, that scale up. And I would reject completely the idea that what I've suggested is some sort of neoclassical market solution. It's exactly the opposite. It's saying that the market will only ever provide housing for a small, not a small fraction, a large fraction, but not a complete proportion of the population. What we need to argue about is how you provide accommodation for the rest. And that's, I'm happy to disagree with Rory and say that he would like the state to directly build. I'd be very concerned about ghettoisation. I want it to be integrated housing. Either way, the state is going to be spending a lot of money on housing. What I would argue is that by doing it in an integrated fashion, you have much better outcomes. But I don't think we're miles apart. I'm certainly not arguing for a market solution to social housing. I'm arguing for a solution based on the idea that every household has a means and every household has a need. And if the means don't meet the need, society needs to write the check.